Welcome, everybody. This is the 94th episode of the Clements Bookworm, and I'm Angela Unk, your host for the morning, and I'm delighted that you're all here. So, just in case you're joining us for the first time, I'll mention that we do use the chat quite a bit. So, feel free to chime in. Just remember to change the settings to everyone so that everyone can see what you're writing. And what that means is if you have a question, please put that in the Q&A section so that we can find them all later. You can also view other people's questions and give them a thumbs up, which will help reorder the questions if there are a lot of them, so we know what we should be talking about. My colleague, Ann Bennington Helber, will be monitoring the chat and pasting in helpful information into that area. And we do have the live machine captions turned on, so please toggle those on or off and change the size as you need to. And hopefully you have some ability to adjust your screen as you need. So please do that. Move the separator so you can see the speaker and the slides well. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of history and culture of North America and the Caribbean to about 1900. I also would like to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we also reaffirm the contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. And I'll also mention that the university has done a big website about the treaty that is really interesting, and we'll paste that into the chat too in case you haven't seen that before. All right, if you haven't answered the poll question, click very quickly so then I can end the poll and share the results to see what people think. All right. It probably should not surprise me that the answer that gets the most votes is the people and their personal stories, since that's what we spend a lot of time talking about at on the Bookworm and at the Clements Library. And so that was 36% of you, but also, of course, we have the political ideas that shaped a new nation, which we're going to, that'll certainly be something we talk a little bit about today. And the documents and artifacts they left behind, which obviously at the Clements Library, we have some really amazing items to continue to study. So thank you so much for taking the poll question. Today's episode is generously sponsored by an anonymous donor. So thank you so much to all of you who take the time out of your Friday morning to watch this program live and continue to support it. And we appreciate that. All right. And without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Michael D. Hattem to the Bookworm this morning to talk about his book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, which was a finalist for the 2025 George Washington Prize. Michael is a historian and author specializing in the American Revolution and historical memory. He earned his PhD in history from Yale University and has taught at Knox College and Lane College at the New School. He is an associate director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this Friday morning. Let's see. Okay. I am going to jump right in with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society about a decade ago. So this is Eliza Wadsworth, and she was a 20-year-old woman who lived with her family at home in Portland, Maine, around the turn of the 19th century. And in January of 1800, having been so moved by the recent death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg Wadsworth, who was a former Continental Army officer, and he was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, if he could get her a memento of the revolutionary hero. And she wrote to him, "Papa, I will tell you what I want more than anything I can think of at present. It is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name." But then she went a step further and asked, "Papa, had he hair? A lock of that I should value more highly still, but I suppose impracticable." Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and enclose Eliza's letter. And 2 weeks later, he received a reply from Tobias Lear, who was the Washington's personal secretary. And in it, he wrote, "The ardent wish expressed by your daughter and your earnest desire for its gratification have induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending the lock of hair I now have the honor to enclose." So shortly after this, Eliza received a package in the mail, and inside were 2 envelopes, and one of them was marked, "Read this first." And in that envelope, a letter from Peleg read, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington. I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." And Eliza described what happened next. She wrote, "I trembled with fear and dare not conjecture what it contained. Imagine my feelings when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe that for a moment I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift. How shall I duly honor this relic?" she wrote. "I feel as if it was too great for me to possess, and I want to give thousands who've never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy." But Eliza's health was quite unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she decided to leave this lock of George Washington's hair in the care of her sister, Zilpah. Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and these letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. Her sister later handed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. And now this story is about it's about more than a young woman and a lock of hair. It's really emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the revolution that Americans began to forge in the early 19th century, particularly as they realized that the revolutionary generation was starting to disappear. And that emotional connection has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so I'm going to begin my talk today by exploring this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years, and to explore a little bit about what it means that we have mythologized the revolution, and what that has looked like in practice. I'm going to focus on the importance of how we tell the story of the revolution, um, of uh, of who tells the story of the revolution, and of when we tell the story of the revolution. Now, the memory of the American Revolution is our national origin myth. And historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is a story that explains how a society or a people came to be and goes some way to defining its character and principles. So, in that case, to mythologize the revolution is not to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but it's to tell the story for the express purpose of explaining how the United States came to be and for the purpose of defining its character and principles. Uh, Now, myths are first and foremost stories. And like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in three acts. The first act is typically focused on the coming of the revolution. If we think about, legislation and events like the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, all the way up to independence. The second act has typically featured the war and is structured around a timeline of famous battles, right? Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. The third and final act has typically recounted how in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to a constitutional convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And so this story structure has a very logical beginning, middle, and end. It's a very recognizable story structure. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that Americans have told this basic story in a familiar form. So this is the hero's journey. It is a common narrative structure in Western mythology that was first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it's a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many ancient hero myths. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, this story structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many directly influenced by Campbell, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, The Matrix, and many others. And so I'm going to suggest to you this morning that how we have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So at the start of the hero's journey, the hero, or in our case, let's say the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. There we go. So if we think about, the 1760s and the attempts by the British Empire to exert greater control over its colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. And, this leads to the creation of a Continental Congress. Now, the hero initially resists the call to adventure, and we might think about Congress refusing to consider independence throughout 1774 and 75, and instead focusing on trying to reconcile with Great Britain. But eventually, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. And we might think of, the revolutionaries accepting the call to adventure in July of 1776 by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. Now, the hero then typically undergoes a series of challenges and temptations. And for the revolution, these trials are typically represented by many of the war's battles. If we think about some of the stories, some of the most famous stories from the war, they, even though they're rooted in actual history, they feature in their retelling mythical themes or near mythological scenarios. If we think about like the story of the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn, or the successful attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 1776, right? You can see those depicted here, including Emanuel Lewitz's famous painting of the crossing of the Delaware. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor, and later receives the timely aid of a helper. And for the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales, when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, we tell the story of the French fleet arriving at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's army and make the siege of Yorktown possible in 1781. And that effectively ends the war and secures independence. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states. But as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And then once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, you guessed it, the Constitution, and return to the known world, which is now changed for the better thanks to the hero's adventure. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative structure feels familiar to us, even without being explicit. We're sort of culturally hardwired in a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses in people. And I think that the fact that the story of the revolution has often been told like this helps us to better understand that unusual emotional connection to the revolution that I mentioned earlier. And I would argue that many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, particularly in their youth and particularly in the 19th century, would have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. And so I want to suggest to you that no small part of the power of the memory of the revolution in our politics and culture for 250 years comes from the fact that it's an origin myth that we have told in the form of a hero myth. And understanding the form in which the story is told, I think, helps us understand our emotional connections to this origin story. And I think that we can see examples of this in a field of study known as fandom studies. Fandom studies explores how people and groups relate to these kinds of stories and other all kinds of facets of popular culture, how they express their emotional connections to these stories, and how those stories influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. And I think there are a lot of sort of civic analogs of the way that these fan cultures express their connections to stories. So let me give you a few examples of that. One of the common ways that fans of stories express their connections to those stories is through conventions, right? Annual events where people who share a love of these stories gather to discuss and express their connections to them. And Americans do the same. Uh, for the American Revolution, every July 4th, or every time they visit places like Mount Vernon, Independence Hall, or the Boston Freedom Trail. Another way that fans express their emotional connections to stories is by engaging in cosplay, right? Where they dress up as their favorite characters from their stories. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. Still, another way that fans express their emotional connections to stories is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories, but featuring the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter or other franchises. And Americans have done a very similar thing by creating and reading historical fiction, right? That is stories set in the Revolutionary era and often featuring real life characters. A fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art, where they create artwork that depicts their favorite characters or famous scenes from the stories. And of course, we might think of John Trumbull's paintings or Emanuel Lewitz's painting as fan art of the American Revolution because these artists clearly have a connection, an emotional connection to the story that they are trying to tell in their artworks, and they want to convey that story and that meaning to their fellow fans or citizens. And one final way that I'll mention that fans express their connections to stories is by visiting recreations of the world of their stories. So, if you're a fan of Harry Potter, you can go to Universal Studios and walk down Diagon Alley. If you're a fan of The Lord of the Rings, you can go to New Zealand and visit the set of the Shire. And people visit these places because they want to inhabit the stories, because it strengthens their connection to the stories and to their fellow community of fans. And this is the same reason that many people have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg or the Boston Freedom Trail or Independence National Historical Park. So we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the revolution have real similarities to these fan cultures. And that is in part because we have often told the story of the revolution in a similar manner to the kinds of stories that prompt the creation of these fan cultures, right? And they are created when a story takes hold of people's imaginations and they establish such a deep emotional connection to the story that it goes on to form part of their personal identity and leads them to create a shared community of their fellow fans. And so I think that at the heart of our relationship to the revolution is something really elemental about how we as humans relate to these kinds of mythologized stories and the effects that they have on us. Now, it's important to point out, though, that even within the general structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific meaning to the revolution. And that is what a historical memory or a popular memory is. It's a way of telling or interpreting a story about the past to attribute a specific meaning to it. And my book shows that Americans have interpreted the meaning of the revolution in many different and often conflicting ways. And which is to say that there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution. And as a national origin myth, the memory of the revolution has been constantly contested and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we have attributed to the revolution often uh, reflect our own times. How we talk about the revolution often reveals far more about the present than the past, and far more about us than the revolution. And I argue in the book that the revolution has essentially provided us with a sort of shared political language that has mediated and helped shape many of our most divisive and hard fought political conflicts. And my book covers 200 plus years of these kinds of conflicts and changing memories of the revolution. So let me give you an example of one of those. Um, for much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the union of the states. And so, for that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances and the final paragraph, right? The sacred pledge at the end. It was not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. But that began to change in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it is the abolitionist movement that created what we might think of as the modern memory of the Declaration. That is, the Declaration defined by the preamble and its principles of liberty and equality rather than independence and union. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mention and quote the Declaration, including notably in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831, which you can see here, which was the most important abolitionist newspaper of the era. And in introducing this new publication, William Lloyd Garrison explained the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston when he wrote, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." You can see he goes on, "Assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population." Abolitionists meeting in Vermont passed a resolution stating that slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, "the fundamental document of our national existence." And that's important because that's new. This idea of the Declaration, having this real fundamental place in not just as an expression, not just as the document that declared independence, but as the document that contains the statement of the nation's core principles and values. That is new. So, in other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the preamble and the principle of equality and liberty, and they defined the revolution by the Declaration. But this did not escape the notice of Southerners, as you can imagine. And in a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase "all men are created equal" as, quote, "merely a rhetorical flourish." Claimed that that phrase in the Declaration was to blame for the wild theories of liberty that were running around the North, meaning abolitionism. In the hands of abolitionists, Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become, quote, "a very seditious instrument." And for them, the Constitution was the fundamental or defining document of the revolution, not the Declaration. That's because the Constitution was one of their primary tools for protecting slavery. And this new egalitarian reading of the Declaration by abolitionists was directly calling slavery into question, right? Essentially, abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which of the two founding documents was the document of the American Revolution, and which defined the revolution and by extension the nation. And in some sense, abolitionists hoped that the Declaration would help save the nation from slavery, while many Southerners hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. And this conflict between the Declaration and the Constitution, over which is the founding document, is a theme that runs throughout the history of the memory of the Revolution in my book. So that's one example of a sort of partisan conflict over the memory of the Revolution that my book covers. But I also want to give you a sense of just how far across the political spectrum the memory of the Revolution has been used, from the far left to the far right. If we skip ahead to the 1930s, as part of its Popular Front strategy, the Communist Party of the United States of America began to use the founders and the memory of the Revolution to redefine itself and its agenda as an extension of the nation's revolutionary ideals and heritage. And they adopted this slogan that you can see here: communism is the Americanism of the 20th century. And you can see it's combined with the famous painting, The Spirit of 76, right, from the late 19th century. But if you look closely, you will see that the Continental Army soldiers here are trampling on a rich businessman, right? And the Communist Party of the U.S. found great value in reminding Americans that the nation had, quote, won its independence in a great liberating revolutionary struggle. They were a group who wanted to see the end of economic classes. And so they adopted the Declaration of Independence as a radical expression of equality at the heart of the nation's founding. In the late 1930s, the CPUSA's platform began by claiming that the Communist Party continues the traditions of 1776. And, the CPUSA's adult school in New York City, their workers' school was named the Jefferson School of Social Science, and it's no coincidence that it's during these years in the late 1930s, very early 1940s, that the Communist Party enjoyed its widest following in the United States. Now, at the same time, on the far right, we have this group, the German-American Bund. They were an American pro-Nazi group that was led by German immigrants. And they were also using the memory of the revolution in the 1930s to aid in their primary cause of isolationism. So their goal was to oppose American intervention into the war. And for that reason, George Washington was a popular symbol for them because of his famous farewell address, right? Which notably called on, future generations of Americans to stay out of European wars. And so on the evening of February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a pro-American rally at the old Madison Square Garden in New York City to commemorate Washington's birthday. And more than 15,000 people attended this rally. And the stage featured an imposing backdrop with a 30-foot full-length image of George Washington, flanked on both sides by 1776 flags and swastikas. And the speakers warned that as more Americans favored entering World War II, quote, we are utterly and completely disregarding the admonition of George Washington today. Now, the Bund used Washington and the memory of the revolution to promote their cause of isolationism, partly because even as recent immigrants, they already recognized and understood the emotional power that the memory of the revolution has with Americans. And so they used it to promote their cause. And ultimately, they tried to convince Americans that that Nazism was a continuation of the American Revolution. And a not insignificant number of Americans were persuaded. So we can get a sense here of, just how far across the political spectrum, the furthest ends of the political spectrum, that the memory of the revolution has been used, and quite successively. And part of the reason for that is because of this unusual emotional relationship that we have had with the revolution, and the power of legitimacy that the memory of the revolution conveys in our politics and in our culture. Uh, so I want to conclude. I'm going to conclude with a with basically my favorite story from the book, that really highlights the importance of when we tell the story of the revolution. Uh, this is Robert Goldstein. He was a Jewish German American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. And after the success of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, he became convinced that a similar large scale historical epic film about the American Revolution could be just as successful. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full length feature film about the American Revolution. And he was going to write, direct, and produce that film himself, even though he had no experience doing any of those things. But he raised a large amount of funding and made this film. His film, The Spirit of 76, debuted in Chicago in May of 1917. And this is just 1 month after the U.S. had officially joined World War I against Germany on behalf of its new ally, Great Britain. And the thing that you need to know is that throughout the 19th century, Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the revolution. But around the turn of the 20th century, relations between the two countries had become more friendly until by 1917, the U.S. is allies in a war with Great Britain. Now, in attendance at this pre-screening in Chicago were some film critics and the city's controversial police censor board. And though one of the critics described the film as, quote, patriotic, the head of the censor board, this man, Major Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, he disagreed. He objected to scenes in the film that showed British atrocities. So, for example, there was a scene in the film where a British soldier is ransacking an American house, and he runs upstairs into a bedroom, and then he sticks his bayonet through a baby's crib. There was another scene in the film that showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. And these scenes, Funkhauser said, would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of our allies in the present war. And so Funkhauser seized the film and he called the Justice Department. And eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show the film so long as he deleted these offending scenes. And we don't really know why. It's not clear why at all. But before the film premiered properly in Los Angeles in November of 1917, Goldstein restored the deleted scenes. It's kind of like the first director's cut. He was arrested immediately after the film premiered, and he was charged under the Espionage Act, which had just been passed a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. His bail was set at $10,000, and The LA Daily Times ran this headline: War of Revolution film seized by government. The case went to trial, and it was presided over by Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would, quote, arouse our revenge and cause us to question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. Now, the media reported all kinds of unfounded rumors about Goldstein. They said that he was a German agent, that he was associating with German agents, that the film was German propaganda. Some said that he was just a dupe of German spies. But eventually, Goldstein was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. He was released from prison early in 1921 because of a review of Espionage Act convictions. And he tried to revive the film. It was shown in New York City at least once. But the sort of moment for that type of film had passed. And so he had to leave the United States for Europe in search of work. And he last turns up in the historical record in Berlin in 1935, where he was arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. And that's the last that we hear of Robert Goldstein. This story is a good example of how the politics of the times shapes the ways that we remember the revolution. Goldstein, I believe, thought he was making a patriotic film that was based on a memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. His story is a reminder of the power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we are young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and as new memories of the revolution emerge to contest or replace it. Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory that he had learned as a kid had not only become outdated, but was now legally treasonous. So if he had, released his film a few years earlier or a few years later, things would likely have turned out very differently for him. But instead, Robert Goldstein was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution. And that film is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of 76 has ever been found. So this story is also an example of, how foreign affairs can have an impact on the memory of the revolution. And in my book, I explore how, both the rise of the Cold War in the 1950s and the end of the Cold War in the 1980s and 90s, also caused significant changes to how the revolution was remembered. And so I want to conclude by sort of reiterating this point about the importance of how we choose to tell the story of the revolution, and how that shapes our connection to the story, how we choose to tell our origin story. There are countless ways to tell the story of the revolution and to have it convey, an equally countless array of meanings. We remember the revolution because it is our national origin story. And in choosing how we tell that story, we express our beliefs and our hopes for the future and our concerns in the present. We've never in our history agreed about what the revolution has meant, what its core ideals of liberty and equality. We've never agreed on what those terms have meant. And my book covers these debates. Instead, what we have done is we have carried on a 250-year dialogue or conversation in which generation after generation has redefined the revolution in ways that made it meaningful to them in the present. And so its relevance has sort of been constantly renewed. And that's part of its importance in our politics and in our culture. Um, in the book, I argue that the memory of the revolution is most importantly served as a vehicle of expression, right? It's given us a shared political language that has mediated our political conflicts. And just like with regular language, the terms that we use can mean different things to different people, and their meanings can change over time. Um, and so, for nearly 250 years, we've used that language to express our political beliefs and our visions of the future. And because of that, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When we look at the revolution, we're effectively looking into a mirror. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. And the revolution is always in the eye of the beholder. And though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past. So the memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Um, that was great. So, everyone, I am just going to do a couple of announcements while you think about whether or not you have any questions to add to the Q&A section, and then we'll go ahead and talk about those questions. So, um, just a reminder that our current exhibit at the Clements Library is Up and Away, A History of Ballooning in America. And that exhibit, the in-person portion, closes August 28th. So that's coming right up. If you want to see it in person, you can do so Monday through Friday, noon to 4. And it is also available online. We are entering that exciting period of move-in on campus. And so we have a lot of guided tours coming up, as we know that people will be coming and going from campus regularly. And so if you happen to be one of those people, we would love to see you in person. Next month, we will host historian and author Jill Lepler to talk about Canal Dreamers, the epic quest to connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the age of revolutions. And we'll talk about, this sort of failed idea of building the world's first interoceanic canal. And so I hope that you'll join us for that. And once you're signed up for the Bookworm, if this is your first time, you'll receive a reminder email next month, and you can choose to join us in person. And but if that's not possible, we also send out the recording and any resources related to the talk the afternoon after the presentation. So you'll receive that as a subscriber. And if you're interested in getting even more involved with the Clements Library, we're always happy to welcome you into our community of donors, the Clements Library Associates. And if you're interested in sponsoring a bookworm, you can always reach out to me about that as well. We appreciate all of you participating in the work that we do in whatever way works best for you. So thank you so much for being here and for telling other people about these programs as well. And thanks once again to our anonymous donor who sponsored today's bookworm. Okay, we have some great questions in the Q&A, but I, one of the things that I would love to hear a little bit about, and I suspect our listeners as well, is what prompted you to write this book? What was there a particular story that you encountered in the archives that made you start to think about this? Or yeah, what happened to prompt this project?
Well, um, so this is my second book. My first book is Past and Prologue: Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, and that was my dissertation as a grad student.
Mhm.
And that was about the role of memory in the revolution and how Americans stopped thinking of the British past as their history and created American history to replace it as part of the process of the revolution. So I was in that, I was in that sort of mindset, and that was right around the time that the Hamilton musical came out. Right, so I guess we're talking 2015 or so. My advisor in grad school was Joanne Freeman, so she was kind of in the middle of that phenomenon, that whirlwind. Um, and I remember just being really struck by the musical of uh, just how much more the musical, reflected, early 2010s Obama era politics, right? More so than it looked like the revolution to me. Um, and so then I started thinking about the memory of the revolution itself, because that plays really no role in my first book. And when I went to look back and see what work had been done on the topic, the main book on the topic was from the bicentennial, and it was a book by Michael Kamen called The Season of Youth. And in that book, he basically looked at stuff like historical fiction and artwork and theater. Um, and he was in primarily in the 19th century, and he was looking for what Americans agreed on about the American Revolution, you know. and But when I started working on this book in 2017, my political circumstances were quite different, and were marked by political conflict. And so I went looking for what Americans disagreed on about the revolution, and so that was my entree into the project. And yeah, ultimately, I worked on the book for about 6 years of research and writing, and it all does really go back to that Hamilton to the Hamilton musical.
I love that, especially since I mean, on this program, we have talked about the Hamilton musical multiple times just because there are things that now it's created
Yeah,
some new memories of the
yeah,
revolution. So sometimes we're debunking things,
yeah.
or, people are just like, hey, I was thinking about, or whatever. And so yeah, that's really interesting. And yeah, I had been thinking, oh, maybe from your first book, there had been some stories where you're like, okay, I got to save those for later. So that's really interesting
No,
that it's sort of,
I didn't really have anything like that, but I did. But uh, so people had mentioned to me, they were like, um, what's the sequel? And
right.
this book is not a sequel to that book. Um, uh, but yeah, I think it seemed logical even to like friends of mine who had read the first book that this was kind of a logical next step, you know. And the other thing people ask me is if I wrote it because of the anniversary, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and I didn't expressly start working on it because of the anniversary. I mean, I started working on it in 2017, just doing the research, and I didn't start writing it until 2022, late 21. And when I started writing it, I thought, I wouldn't be able to write it in time for the anniversary. But then the writing went just much faster than I anticipated, just because I'd been walking around for 6, 7 years just thinking about all this stuff.
Right.
So yeah, when I started working on the book, I wasn't sure I would even be able to make 26 as the deadline, but it just worked out. It worked out that I did.
That's great. Thank you for answering that. Um, so yeah, everybody, I can see sort of the wheels turning in some of these questions because
Yeah,
people are trying to
great
think about,
questions.
yeah, different regions, different
Yep.
groups, and how it differs. So one of the things that people are really wondering about, and you touched upon it a little bit, but how much did that revolution myth differ between the northern and southern states, and what were the key differences?
Yeah. So I mean, so part of it, which I talked about in the talk, had to do with which of the two founding documents was the defining document of the revolution. That is a major sectional difference. Um, there are other conflicts between North and South, especially in the antebellum period, that you will find in the book. There are conflicts over the histories of the revolution that are published in the 1840s and 1850s, because most of them are published or are written by New Englanders, and they often downplay or sometimes even denigrate uh, the lack of contribution of some of the southern states, right? Um, and many southern writers complained about this. Um, they wrote books to refute those claims. They went on speaking tours throughout the North to refute those claims. Um, so there are lots of arguments about who contributed, which states contributed the most to the revolution. I mean, that's actually part of the famous Charles Sumner, the caning of Charles Sumner. Part of what they're arguing about is Sumner is before that happens is that Sumner is sort of claiming that South Carolina really contributed almost nothing to the revolution. That's part of their argument that leads to that famous incident. So there are lots of conflicts like that. And then even past the 1850s and 1860s, you know, my book looks at the way that um, that the ideas of liberty and equality changed in the late 19th century after the end of slavery, especially in the South, because now those terms had to mean something different because uh, because of the end of the institution of slavery. So there's lots of uh, these kinds of conflicts and contests, different conflicting ways of remembering the revolution between North and South.
Right. Thank you. Um, Jim Davis is now thinking about the different people who might have um, different kinds of trajectories. And so, have you thought at all about loyalists, Canadians, Native American groups, and how their understanding of the revolution could also be dealing with it as myth?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I
Right.
didn't read any Canadian sources for this book, but what I can tell you is that one that loyalists play almost no role in the popular memory of the revolution, besides a few of the most well-known loyalists like Thomas Hutchinson or somebody like that, and their role is as a villain, right? But the loyalists are largely left out of the memory of the revolution throughout 19th century, because their part of the story does not support the meanings that many Americans wanted to attribute to the revolution, right? If your story is about liberty and equality, the loyalists complicate that narrative, right? In
Mhm.
very uneasy ways, and so they are largely left out. Uh, there's a few scattered books in the 19th century on loyalists, but it's not really until um, after the turn of the 20th century that we start to that academic historians start to look at the experience of the loyalists. But their experience or their role in the memory of the revolution is a reminder of how I mentioned how we make choices about what to include in the story, what not to include in the story, just like historians have to make those choices, right? um, uh, we as citizens make those same kinds of choices when it comes to our popular memory. And loyalists are a good example of that.
Mhm. Thank you. Okay, so Hoyt is asking, do you view this rise of the revolutionary preamble as inevitable, as if Jefferson had planted a time bomb in the text, or highly dependent on the battle over the peculiar issue of slavery?
Oh, that is a great question, Hoyt. That is, um, I don't, well, I wouldn't say anything is inevitable. As a historian, I typically avoid that term. It is the case that it was the rise of the issue of slavery that brought the preamble to its prominence, right? Um, it stayed there because because Americans continually found new ways of defining liberty and equality. So for example, in the 1830s and 40s, at the same time that abolitionists are talking about the preamble, we have the women's rights movement, talking about the quoting the Declaration. We have um, uh, 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 trade groups, like sort of proto trade unions, workers groups who are issuing their own declarations of independence. The Workers' Declaration of Independence. Um, uh, so uh, so there are continually lots those principles get redefined, and that's what sort of um, keeps the has kept the preamble relevant and grown its stature. The historian Pauline Maier wrote a famous book about the Declaration called American Scripture, right? And that is a great moniker for the Declaration, because it just like Scripture, it has this sort of central, it's like a central text of our civic religion, right? But also, like Scripture, it is open to interpretation, right?
Right.
um, and I don't think that Jefferson had no intention that the preamble would ever be used to justify the equality uh, of enslaved persons or of women, or of Native Americans. But Abraham Lincoln did believe that. He said in the 1850s, he said um, uh, that the phrase "all men are created equal" had no effectual purpose in the moment of independence, and he said that it was put there, quote, for future use, right? And I talk in the book about how the preamble of the Declaration has been central to this the idea of the unfinished revolution. And that's an
Yeah.
important part of the memory of the revolution, right? The idea that the revolution is unfinished, and that the way um, to honor the memory of the revolution uh, is to work in the present to more fully realize its core principles and values, right? And that really starts with the abolitionists, and then has been an important part of the rhetoric of almost every major social movement that we've had um, in the 19th and 20th centuries.
Yeah, and it feels like with the 250th, we're really hearing those arguments loudly again, where it's like
Mhm.
it's unfinished, and then the people who are like, no, it's done.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Those are the two sort of, I talk about this in the book, the sort of two approaches to the memory of the revolution, but they're also are the two general approaches to the idea of patriotism. And these
mm,
emerge in the early 20th century. And one is, this idea of the unfinished revolution. And then the other sort of more conservative approach to patriotism is more celebratory, right?
right.
A little less critical, more focused on individuals, right? Especially elite individuals. Um, and I have a new book coming out in November on the Declaration of Independence that goes into all this even more than I could in this book. So
Perfect. Well, we'll look forward to that one too. Um, so Camden is thinking about how statues, memorials, monuments, house museums contribute to the historical memory of the American Revolution, and wondering if they fall under the fan art or inhabit worlds categories.
that's a great question. The house museums for sure fall under the inhabit worlds category. Um, it was important to me in this book to incorporate the histories of some of our most significant um, house museums and historical sites into my narrative, right? Because I believe that these historical sites play an important role in shaping the memory of the revolution. And so, in the book, you will learn about the political conflicts, the sectional conflicts around the establishment of Mount Vernon as a house museum in the 1860s. You'll learn about um, the role of anti-Semitism in the creation of Monticello as a house museum. Um, you learn about the role of the Cold War in the creation of Independence Hall National Historical Park. Um, and so yeah, so it was important for me to include these stories of these house museums, especially, but a few of our most important historical sites uh, in within the narrative of the revolution, and that it because of because of my belief in the importance of those institutions. Um, so I'll give you an example, an archival example. Um, in the chapter where I write about um, when Independence National Historical Park was created as a national park in the early 1950s, I wanted to get a sense of, if you visited Independence Hall in 1952, what were the guides telling you, right? What was the story that they were telling? And so I went to their archives, Independence Hall archives, um, and was able to read the uh, the manuals and guidebooks that they gave to guides in the early 1950s. You know, and to read like the transcripts of television programs that were filmed there, but that no longer existed on film. Uh, so uh, yeah, so that and reading those was very interesting, and and allowed me um, to do this work of incorporating the house museums into the story.
Thank you. Um, Marie is thinking a little bit about constructivism and positivism, um, and thinking about how they're sort of intertwined in
Yeah,
retelling the story, and just any comments you might have on that.
yeah, it's. I mean, our memories of the revolution are fundamentally constructed, right? Um, when people have a conflict over, conflicting meanings of the revolution throughout our history and right down to the present. It's almost never a conflict over between, correct facts and incorrect facts, right? It's almost always matters of interpretation, right? So, historical memories are fundamentally constructed. Um, but at the same time, you can't just say anything about the past, right? Especially if you want to convince, a broad audience. So, whatever the story or the meaning that you want to attribute to the revolution, um, it has to, it has to be rooted in facts, right? Um, to be persuasive in the first place, right? But of course, you know, you can interpret you can uh, you can interpret the same facts in many different ways. The historian Joe Lepore said that um, the revolution is an ocean of ideas. You can fish almost anything out of it, right? Uh, so there is a so it is these memories are fundamentally constructed, but they have to have some they have to be rooted to some extent in facts to be persuasive to a broad public.
Yeah, that's I love the way you put that, and Jill's that is a great quote.
Yeah, that's a great question.
So Rebecca is thinking a little more specifically, what were the important considerations during the 1926 anniversary? And would the telling of the story of the revolution at that time have related to the recent passage of the Johnson-Reed Act?
Okay. 1926 is the great outlier of major anniversaries of independence. 1826 was a big national celebration. 1876 and the centennial was a big national celebration. 1926 passed with very little notice, relatively speaking. There was a major event, a fair in Philadelphia, like there had been in 1876, but it was a big failure, lost a lot of money, not many people came. Um, and I think that part of the reason for that is that the major anniversaries of independence, uh, they matter more when things are not going well, right? So if we think about, you know, the centennial, 1876, the contested presidential election, right, which is decided by the House. It's still the wake of the Panic of 1873. So there's economic, they're in a recession. They're fighting over the end of Reconstruction, right? There is the beginning of the explosion of immigration in the late 19th century. So there's lots of turmoil and instability around the centennial, and the same thing for the bicentennial, right? I mean, if you think about the 1970s, the bicentennial happens amid presidential scandals and corruption, an economic recession, an energy crisis, right? A gas crisis, um, an unpopular foreign war. All of these things sound familiar, right? Um, so, uh, but 1926 happens in the middle of the Roaring '20s. Things are good. The Depression is 3 years away, right? And because things were going so well, people needed the anniversary less. And so 1926 was not a major anniversary. It just was not given the attention that all the others were given. And in terms of the Johnson-Reed Act, not the Johnson-Reed Act specifically, and not 1926, but in the book, I talk about the role of immigration in the late 19th century and the early 20th century um, in shaping the memory of the revolution, particularly in in um, what's the word I'm thinking of? Inspiring the creation of the first uh, hereditary patriotic societies, like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution. A big part of why those groups were created was because of the perceived threat of immigration and of a desire to, all those groups created programs immediately aimed at educating immigrants about how to properly understand the American Revolution, right? Um, so immigration is a is an important theme in the book, just not for 1926 specifically.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, Carl is wondering what the image is on the cover of your book and when and where it was painted.
It's the Apotheosis of George Washington, which is a painting that was done in 1851 by the Italian Greek artist Constantine Brumidi, and and it is in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol building. It was painted for that purpose. So if you go to the Capitol building, you go to the rotunda, look up, there it is. And you know, think about the significance of that. Think about the significance of the federal government commissioning a painting and then installing it in, the main gathering area of the home of the legislature, a painting of the first president and revolutionary hero ascending to heaven as a god with all these other, Greek and Roman gods. Um, the the implications of that, are actually quite stunning. But it happens in the 1850s at a time, during the time of a sectional crisis. And Washington was seen at the time as one of the few figures who sort of transcended the sectional divide.
Thank you. Um, Jacqueline has a good question to think about that also then ties in a little bit to a discussion that was happening in the chat that Peter Jackson brought up, and she was also commenting on. So she's thinking about whether or not you have any thoughts of the role elementary and middle school educators play in shaping that first emotional response to the events in American history.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, Historically, the the basic story of the revolution has been learned in classrooms, right? Of course, just like the civic context works basically the same as the religious context, which is you want to teach your narratives as early as you can, right? Because the earlier students learn those narratives, the less likely they are to um, allow them to be challenged as in their adulthood. I do talk in the book about, the role of textbooks um, in shaping the memory of the revolution, including the nation's first textbook controversy, curriculum controversy, which happens in the 1920s, first in New York City and then across the country. There was a big scandal over textbooks um, that conservatives claimed, denigrated the founders, denigrated the revolution, right? Um, and of course, that then becomes a sort of periodic feature of American politics. We get those curriculum textbook controversies every 10 or 15 years or so um, because because the memory of the revolution has this, emotional power, and so it's very useful politically. um, so yeah, so there is some stuff in the book about um, the role of uh, education in shaping the memory of the revolution.
Yeah, so I think that sort of ties into a discussion that was happening about different generations and their memories of the revolution. And
Yeah, I mean, I looked at a lot of textbooks from the 1950s to see what students were. I looked at educational films. So, like Encyclopedia Britannica used to produce short films for the classroom, and I watched their short films on the revolution, which were shown in many classrooms. Um, and you would not be surprised to find out that the way they depicted the revolution um, fit very much with the sort of Cold War ideology, right? Which was stressing the idea of individual liberty, of limited government, right? And of free trade or capitalism, right? Uh, those are the key pillars of the what I call the Cold War memory of the revolution in the book, um, and it's really a product of the 1950s.
yeah, that's so interesting. Well, people are asking great questions, but
Yeah,
I fear we have come to the end of our time. So yes, so read the book, and
these are all great questions.
yeah, very much. And I appreciate everyone staying on for so long for the discussion and just really thinking deeply about this topic. And for those of you who've been participating in the bookworm for a long time, you also know that there are so many small stories within the time period of the revolution as well, and just our our understanding of that time period sometimes is uh has had we think of it as a very narrow thing because of this memory that you're talking about, when in fact, boy, there was a lot going on.
A
So,
lot and a lot to fight
um,
about.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So thank you, everybody. And thanks so much, Michael. This was really spectacular.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.